The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945. Operation Iceberg involved the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. More than 180,000 American troops from 5 Army divisions and 2 Marine divisions landed on Okinawa's beaches. The island was strategically vital. Located only 340 miles from mainland Japan, Okinawa would provide bases for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Capturing it was essential. Losing it was unacceptable to Japan. The Japanese High Command designated Okinawa as the final defensive line. Over 100,000 Japanese troops defended the island, but conventional defense was only part of Japan's strategy. Kamikaze attacks became Japan's primary naval weapon. Waves of suicide aircraft struck American ships throughout the campaign. Individual destroyers on radar picket duty faced dozens of kamikaze attacks in single days. Many ships were sunk. Many more were damaged. American sailors died in fires and explosions as kamikaze aircraft crashed into their vessels with devastating effect. For Navy flight nurses operating from Guam, the Okinawa campaign presented unprecedented challenges. The scale of casualties dwarfed even Iwo Jima. During peak periods in April and May 1945, American casualties exceeded 1,000 per day. Evacuation requirements overwhelmed available resources. WWII expanded operations dramatically. By June 1945, the squadron operated 33 R-5D Skymaster aircraft with 54 pilots. These larger aircraft could carry up to 60 wounded on litters. Flight nurses now had 74 trained personnel assigned to Pacific operations. The system established at Iwo Jima scaled up to meet Okinawa's demands. Multiple aircraft flew continuous missions from Guam to Okinawa. Pilots coordinated with battlefield controllers to sequence landings at Yontan and Kadena airfields. Flight nurses worked in rotation to maintain coverage without fatigue-induced errors. Hospital facilities on Guam expanded to receive the increased patient flow. On one record-breaking day in June 1945, WRE-1 completed 12 flights from Guam to Okinawa and back. Each flight carried dozens of wounded. Hundreds of men evacuated in a single day. This was industrial-scale medical evacuation, not individual heroics, not dramatic moments, systematic execution of coordinated procedures by trained personnel working within an integrated system. The flight nurses who made this possible faced the same challenges Kendai had encountered at Iwo Jima, multiplied by the scale and duration of the Okinawa campaign. 7-hour flights with critically wounded patients, unpressurized cabins at altitude, minimal equipment, no backup, constant decision-making about morphine administration, fluid replacement, oxygen therapy, emergency interventions. The difference at Okinawa was that these flights continued for 3 months, for 3 rather than 2 weeks. The cumulative physical and psychological toll on flight nurses was enormous. Mary Hudnall, one of the flight nurses who evacuated casualties from Iwo Jima and later Okinawa, recalled the emotional impact of the work. Patients would offer small mementos as thanks. One Marine insisted she take a medicine bottle filled with sand from Iwo Jima. He wanted her to have something to remember him by. These small gestures created bonds between nurses and wounded that transcended standard medical professional relationships. Flight nurses were not just providing clinical care, they were offering human connection to men who had survived battlefield trauma and now faced uncertain futures. Many wounded Marines and soldiers had lost friends in combat. Many faced permanent disabilities. Many were in shock, physically and psychologically. The presence of a woman on these evacuation flights, a nurse who spoke calmly and provided gentle care, had psychological value beyond the medical interventions themselves. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. During the Okinawa campaign, Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Forces aircraft evacuated 16,599 casualties from the island. Nearly 60% of those evacuations, approximately 11,771 wounded, were flown out aboard WRE-1 aircraft with Navy flight nurses providing in-flight medical care. This represented the first time in military history that air evacuation exceeded sea evacuation for battlefield casualties. The shift was permanent. From Okinawa forward, air medical evacuation would be the primary method for moving seriously wounded from combat zones to hospitals. The system had proven itself. Speed saved lives. Organization enabled speed. Trained flight nurses made the system effective. The success of the Navy's flight nurse program contrasted sharply with institutional resistance to women in combat zones. Throughout the Second World War, military regulations prohibited women from serving in designated combat areas. These regulations remained in effect even as women like Kende landed on active battlefields under artillery fire. The contradiction was resolved through bureaucratic fiction. Flight nurses were classified as medical personnel, not combat personnel. Their presence in combat zones was justified as necessary for patient care, not as combat service. This distinction allowed the military to utilize their skills while maintaining the legal prohibition against women in combat. But everyone involved understood the reality. Landing on Iwo Jima or Okinawa while the battle raged was combat service, regardless of bureaucratic classifications. Flight nurses faced the same risks as any other military personnel in those combat zones. Japanese artillery did not distinguish between medical aircraft and combat aircraft. Sniper fire did not distinguish between nurses and Marines. The dangers were real and immediate. Yet, flight nurses received no combat decorations. Military regulations prohibited awarding combat medals to medical personnel classified as non-combatants. The Navy Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, with Combat WWII device, all were restricted to personnel engaged in combat operations. Providing medical care during combat did not qualify. This bureaucratic distinction meant that flight nurses who repeatedly flew into active combat zones, who faced enemy fire, who saved hundreds of lives under conditions of extreme danger, received no formal recognition beyond unit citations and standard service medals. The injustice was obvious to everyone, except the bureaucrats who enforced the regulations. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, recognized the contribution of flight nurses to Allied victory. In official reports, Nimitz credited air medical evacuation as a crucial factor in maintaining combat effectiveness. The ability to evacuate wounded quickly kept Marines and soldiers fighting because they knew they would receive rapid care if wounded. Morale depended partly on confidence in the medical system. Flight nurses provided that confidence. But even Nimitz could not overcome regulations prohibiting combat decorations for non-combatant personnel. He could commend, he could praise, he could issue unit citations. He could not award the medals that flight nurses deserved. The institutional response to this problem was silence. Rather than acknowledge the contradiction, the Navy simply avoided discussing it. Flight nurses continued their work without recognition. Official histories of Pacific campaigns mentioned air evacuation in passing without naming the nurses who made it possible. Photographic records showed flight nurses tending wounded, but captions rarely included names. The visual evidence documented their presence. The textual record erased their contribution. Jane Kende herself embodied this contradiction. She was simultaneously celebrated and ignored. Newspapers published photographs of her tending wounded on Iwo Jima. The images were dramatic and emotionally powerful. A young woman in uniform kneeling beside stretchers on a battlefield. The visual symbolism resonated with American audiences, but the articles accompanying those photographs focused on her role as a symbol rather than her skills as a medical professional. She was the first Navy nurse to land on a Pacific battlefield. This was historically significant. But what she did after landing, the medical decisions she made, the lives she saved through professional competence, received minimal attention. The symbolism overshadowed the substance. After Okinawa was secured in late June 1945, many flight nurses were reassigned to repatriation missions. Allied prisoners of war held by Japan in the Philippines and elsewhere needed evacuation to medical leave. facilities. These men had survived years of captivity under brutal conditions. Many suffered from malnutrition, disease, and injuries sustained during imprisonment. Repatriating them required medical care similar to battlefield evacuation. Flight nurses flew these missions throughout July and August 1945. By the time Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, Navy flight nurses had evacuated tens of thousands of casualties from Pacific battlefields and prison camps. The exact number was never officially compiled. Different sources provided different statistics, but conservative estimates suggested over 20,000 wounded and sick personnel were evacuated by Navy aircraft, with flight nurses providing in-flight care. 20,000 lives saved through systematic medical evacuation. 20,000 men who might have died without rapid transport to surgical facilities. 20,000 families who received their sons and husbands back because a new system of battlefield medicine had been developed and implemented by women like Jane Kendall. Yet, when the war ended, institutional gratitude proved limited. Military regulations prohibited married women from serving as military nurses. This regulation had been temporarily suspended in January 1945 due to personnel shortages. But in November 1945, with the war over and demobilization beginning, the Navy reinstated the marriage ban. Any nurse who married was immediately dismissed from service. The choice was explicit: military nursing career or family. Not both. Most flight nurses chose family. By 1946, nearly all of the women who had pioneered battlefield air evacuation in the Pacific had left military service. Some married and started families. Some returned to civilian nursing. Some pursued entirely different careers. A few remained in the Navy through the 1950s and 60s, but these were exceptions. The institutional knowledge accumulated through combat experience was lost as the trained personnel dispersed into civilian life. The Navy made no systematic effort to document their experiences. No official history of the flight nurse program was commissioned. No after-action reports compiled lessons learned. No training manual preserved techniques developed in combat. The women simply left, and their knowledge left with them. The marriage ban itself revealed deep institutional prejudices. Male officers could marry without affecting their careers. Male enlisted personnel could marry. But female nurses faced discharge if they married. The policy assumed that married women could not maintain professional competence while fulfilling family obligations. This assumption had no basis in evidence. It reflected cultural attitudes about women's proper roles rather than any rational assessment of professional capability. The ban remained in effect until the 1960s, when changing social attitudes and personnel needs finally forced the Navy to abandon it. But by then, an entire generation of pioneering female military aviators and medical specialists had been forced from service simply because they chose to marry. Jane Kendall married after the war. Her Navy career ended with her marriage. She returned to civilian life, worked as a nurse in San Diego, and rarely spoke publicly about her wartime service. In a 1985 newspaper interview, she summarized her attitude toward recognition with a quote that appeared in multiple sources. "Our rewards are wan smiles, a slow nod of appreciation, a gesture, a word, accolades greater, more heartwarming than any medal." This statement was simultaneously true and tragic. True because the human connection with patients did matter more than formal recognition. Tragic because it rationalized institutional injustice. Flight nurses deserved both. They deserved the emotional satisfaction of helping wounded men, and they deserved official recognition of their combat service and professional achievement. They received one, but not the other. The long-term legacy of Navy flight nurses extended far beyond their individual service. The systematic approach to battlefield medical evacuation they helped pioneer became standard practice in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, helicopter medical evacuation, medevac, utilized the same principles developed during World War II. rapid transport from battlefield to surgical facility, trained medical personnel providing care during transit, coordinated systems integrating detection, transportation, and treatment. The technology changed. Helicopters replaced fixed-wing aircraft for many missions, but the underlying concept remained identical. During the Vietnam War, medevac became even more sophisticated. Helicopter ambulances could land directly at casualty sites. Flight time from wounding to hospital averaged under an hour. Survival rates for wounded who reached surgical care were the highest in military history. This success built directly on foundations established by nurses like Kende in 1945. Modern military medical evacuation continues this evolution. Dedicated medical evacuation aircraft carry advanced equipment and highly trained flight medical teams. Critical care air transport teams can provide intensive care during flight. Wounded personnel can be transported from combat zones to major medical centers in the United States within days. Survival rates continue to improve. The underlying principle remains unchanged. Speed saves lives. From Iwo Jima in March 1945 to Afghanistan in the 21st century, the fundamental truth of battlefield medicine is that rapid evacuation to surgical care dramatically improves survival. Jane Kende and her fellow flight nurses helped prove this principle when it was still controversial. Their success established air medical evacuation as an essential military capability rather than an experimental program. The specific techniques Kende used were products of their time: morphine syrettes, plasma infusions, basic airway management, wound care, shock treatment. Modern battlefield medicine has advanced far beyond these basics, but the decision-making process remains similar. Assess casualties, prioritize treatment, determine who needs immediate intervention, decide who can wait, recognize who cannot be saved. Make these decisions quickly, under stress, with incomplete information. This is triage. Combat medics, corpsmen, and flight nurses still perform triage every day in every conflict. The tools have changed. The fundamental challenge has not. Jane Kende faced this challenge on Iwo Jima in 1945 with 30 wounded Marines, minimal equipment, and 30 minutes before takeoff. Modern flight nurses face similar challenges with better equipment, but equally difficult circumstances. The title question, how one nurse's forbidden morphine trick saved 800 Marines in just 6 hours, can now be answered precisely. There was no single forbidden trick. Morphine administration was standard procedure, not forbidden practice. One nurse did not save 800 Marines. Multiple flight nurses saved thousands through systematic execution of coordinated procedures. The time frame was not 6 hours, but months of continuous operations. The real story is more complex and more impressive than any simplified narrative. The real story is that the United States Navy recognized a problem. Battlefield casualties were dying during evacuation and developed a systematic solution. Train specialized flight nurses, establish dedicated evacuation squadrons, coordinate operations between battlefields and hospitals, implement standardized procedures, execute repeatedly under combat conditions. Refine based on experience. This systematic approach saved not hundreds, but thousands of lives. The women who implemented this system faced discrimination, danger, and institutional ingratitude. They served anyway. They flew into combat zones that military regulations declared off-limits to women. They made life-and-death medical decisions under conditions that would have overwhelmed many male officers. They saved thousands of lives. They received minimal recognition. Then they were forced from service by regulations that assumed married women could not maintain professional competence. This is the actual history, not a single dramatic moment, but a sustained institutional achievement, built through the courage and competence of women like Jane Kende, who refused to accept that gender should determine capability. The lesson transcends the specific details of wartime nursing. The fundamental lesson concerns institutional innovation and the individuals who make innovation possible. Military organizations are inherently conservative. Established procedures are favored over experimental approaches. Traditional methods are trusted more than untested innovations. Cultural prejudices, such as prohibitions against women in combat zones, persist despite evidence that they are counterproductive. Change happens when individuals with vision and courage push against institutional resistance. Captain Daniel Tomlinson recognized that air evacuation needed specialized personnel. Jane Kennedy and her fellow nurses proved that women could perform under combat conditions. Admiral Chester Nimitz supported their efforts despite bureaucratic obstacles. Together, these individuals created a system that saved thousands of lives and established practices that continue today. But institutional change is incomplete when recognition is denied. The Navy benefited enormously from flight nurse contributions. American casualties survived at rates unprecedented in military history. Morale remained high because wounded men knew they would receive rapid care. Combat effectiveness improved because personnel trusted the medical system. Yet the women who delivered these benefits were denied combat decorations, forced from service when they married, and largely erased from official histories. This combination of utilization without recognition, of benefiting from innovation while denying credit to innovators, represents an institutional failing that extends far beyond the specific case of flight nurses. It reflects broader patterns of discrimination against women in military service and in American society generally during this period. Jane Kennedy died on July 19, 1987, at age 65. Obituaries described her as a pioneering Navy flight nurse, but provided minimal detail about her service. No major newspaper published extended profiles. No television documentaries examined her contributions. She remained largely unknown, except to veterans who remembered being evacuated from Pacific battlefields and to historians who studied battlefield medicine. In recent decades, interest in her story has increased. Museums have created exhibits about Navy flight nurses. Historians have written articles and books documenting their service. The National Museum of the Pacific War and the Naval History and Heritage Command have published materials recognizing flight nurse contributions to victory. But this renewed interest came decades after Kennedy's death. Recognition arrived too late to matter to the woman who earned it. This pattern, recognition delayed until the recipients are dead, is unfortunately common in military history. Individuals who break barriers, who pioneer new fields, who challenge institutional prejudices often receive acknowledgement only after they are gone. The living face resistance and discrimination. The dead receive posthumous praise that costs nothing and changes nothing. It would have been better to recognize Kennedy's achievements during her lifetime, to award her the combat decorations she earned, to preserve her experiences in official histories, to acknowledge that her gender was irrelevant to her professional competence. But institutional change happens slowly. Cultural attitudes shift gradually. The prejudices that shaped policy in 1945 required decades to overcome. The nurses who flew with Kennedy shared her experience of service without recognition. Mary Hudnall, who kept the bottle of Iwo Jima sand given by a grateful Marine. The dozens of other nurses whose names appear in squadron rosters but rarely in historical accounts. These women flew hundreds of missions, evacuated thousands of wounded, saved countless lives. Most received no individual recognition beyond service medals awarded to all military personnel. Their contribution was collective rather than individual. This is partly why their stories remain less known than those of fighter pilots or infantry officers. Military culture celebrates individual heroism more than systematic competence. The dramatic moment, the bold action, the visible achievement receive attention and recognition. The sustained effort, the professional competence, the systematic execution of coordinated procedures receive less attention, even when their impact is greater. Flight nurses' contribution to victory was systematic rather than dramatic. They did not shoot down enemy aircraft. They did not capture enemy positions. They did not lead charges or make tactical decisions that changed battles. What they did was save lives through professional medical care delivered under extraordinarily difficult conditions. This mattered as much as any combat action, perhaps more. Because saving lives is ultimately the purpose of winning battles. But institutional recognition systems favored combat actions over life-saving medical care. This created a persistent bias against recognizing medical personnel generally and female medical personnel specifically. The bias has diminished over time, but has not disappeared entirely. Even today, medical personnel receive less recognition than combat personnel, despite their essential contribution to military effectiveness. The technological legacy of Navy flight nurses is clear. Modern military medical evacuation builds directly on systems they helped pioneer. But the cultural legacy is more ambiguous. Women now serve in combat roles throughout the American military. Combat exclusions have been eliminated. Female pilots fly combat missions. Female soldiers serve in infantry units. This represents enormous progress, but discrimination persists in subtle forms. Female service members still face harassment and institutional resistance. Recognition for achievement remains uneven. The barriers are lower, but they have not disappeared. Jane Kenday's experience, service without recognition, remains relevant because similar patterns persist today. Different circumstances, different specifics, same underlying dynamic. Women contribute. Institutions benefit. Recognition is delayed or denied. Change happens slowly. This makes understanding her story important beyond historical interest. The pattern she experienced, breaking barriers while facing discrimination, continues to affect women in military service and in professional fields generally. Recognizing this pattern is necessary for changing it. The story of how one nurse's so-called forbidden morphine trick saved hundreds of Marines, when examined closely, becomes a story about institutional innovation, systematic problem-solving, gender discrimination, and the individuals who created change despite facing resistance. It is a story about courage, not just physical courage in combat zones, but moral courage in challenging institutional barriers. It is a story about competence, professional expertise applied under conditions of extreme stress, with lives depending on the outcome. Most importantly, it is a true story, not sensationalized, not simplified, not reduced to a single dramatic moment. A complex, historical reality involving thousands of individuals, systematic institutional change, technological innovation, cultural prejudice, and ultimate success, measured in thousands of lives saved. This is how history actually happens, not through predetermined destiny or inevitable progress, but through specific individuals making specific decisions in specific circumstances, often facing resistance, always dealing with imperfect information and limited resources, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, but accumulating over time into patterns of change that transform institutions and societies. Jane Kenday stood in the doorway of an R-4D transport aircraft on March 6, 1945, looking down at Iwo Jima. She did not know she was making history. She was doing her job, a job she had trained for, a job that needed doing. She landed. She assessed casualties. She loaded wounded onto her aircraft. She provided medical care during flight. She delivered patients to hospital facilities. Then she went back and did it again and again and again, for weeks at Iwo Jima, for months at Okinawa, until the war ended and institutional regulations forced her from service. This is not a story with a satisfying narrative arc. The heroine does not receive recognition she deserves. The institutional injustice is not corrected during her lifetime. The system benefits from her contribution while denying her proper credit. This is frustrating from a storytelling perspective, but it is accurate from a historical perspective. Many important contributions to victory in the Second World War followed this pattern. Individuals did essential work. Institutions benefited. Recognition was incomplete or delayed. African American servicemen fought with distinction while facing segregation and discrimination. Women contributed across multiple fields while facing institutional barriers. Working-class personnel provided essential labor while receiving minimal acknowledgement. The complete history of the war includes these stories of contribution without recognition alongside the celebrated stories of acknowledged heroism. Understanding both types of stories provides a more complete and more accurate picture of how the war was actually won, not just through the actions of celebrated generals and admirals, but through the systematic efforts of millions of individuals, many of whom faced discrimination while serving, who contributed to victory despite institutional resistance. This is the real story of how one Navy flight nurse helped save not 800, but thousands of Marines through not a forbidden morphine trick, but systematic professional medical care delivered under combat conditions as part of a coordinated air evacuation system that represented institutional innovation during wartime. The story is complex. The achievements are significant. The recognition was inadequate. The legacy continues. And Jane Kendall, who never sought fame, but served with quiet professional competence, deserves to be remembered not as a symbol, but as a skilled medical professional who helped establish practices that continue to save lives today. Transforming military medicine. The Navy Flight Nurse Program, established during World War II, created ripples that extended far beyond the Pacific Theater. The systematic approach to battlefield medical evacuation fundamentally changed how modern militaries think about casualty care. Before this program, wounded personnel faced long, dangerous journeys by ship or ground transport. The survival rate depended heavily on how quickly someone could reach surgical facilities. The Flight Nurse Program proved that air evacuation with trained medical personnel could dramatically reduce mortality rates. This principle, that speed, combined with professional care during transport saves lives, became the foundation of modern combat medicine. Every medevac helicopter in Korea, every dust-off mission in Vietnam, every critical care air transport in Iraq and Afghanistan traces its lineage directly to what Kendall and her colleagues pioneered in 1945. Gender barriers in military service. The Flight Nurse Program exposed fundamental contradictions in how the military handled women's service. These women flew into active combat zones, faced enemy fire, made life and death medical decisions under extreme stress, and saved thousands of lives. Yet, military regulations classified them as non-combatants to maintain the legal fiction that women didn't serve in combat. This bureaucratic contradiction had real consequences. Flight nurses couldn't receive combat decorations despite performing combat service. They faced discharge if they married. Their contributions were minimized in official histories. The institutional message was clear. We need your skills, but we won't fully acknowledge your service or treat you as equals. This pattern didn't end in 1945. For decades afterward, women in military service continued facing similar contradictions, performing essential duties while being denied full recognition and equal treatment. Combat exclusion policies remained in effect until 2013, nearly 70 years after Kendall landed on Iwo Jima under artillery fire. The cost of institutional prejudice. The marriage ban that forced most flight nurses from service after the war represents a significant institutional failure. The Navy had invested heavily in training these women. They had accumulated invaluable combat experience. They had developed techniques and procedures that saved lives. When they were forced out due to marriage, all that institutional knowledge dispersed. No systematic effort was made to document their experiences. No comprehensive training manuals preserved their techniques. No after-action reports captured lessons learned. The assumption that married women couldn't maintain professional competence cost the military dearly. When the Korean War began just 5 years later, much of this expertise had to be rebuilt from scratch. This wasn't just wasteful. It was deadly. How many lives might have been saved if experienced flight nurses had remained in service to train the next generation? How much more effective might early Korean War evacuation efforts have been with that continuity of expertise? The cost of discrimination isn't just measured in injustice to individuals, it's measured in lost institutional capability and ultimately in lives. Recognition. Delayed as recognition. Denied. Jane Kende died in 1987 without receiving significant recognition for her pioneering service. Museums and historians have since documented the flight nurse program's contributions, but this attention came too late for most of the women who served. They lived their lives, worked their careers, raised their families, and died without the recognition they earned. This pattern of delayed recognition appears repeatedly in military history, particularly for groups that face discrimination. African American servicemen who fought with distinction in segregated units waited decades for proper acknowledgement. Native American code talkers went unrecognized for years due to classification. Women who served in various capacities throughout military history have been systematically underrepresented in official accounts. Posthumous recognition feels hollow because it costs nothing and changes nothing for the individuals who earned it. It's easier to praise the dead than to confront discrimination against the living. Real recognition means changing policies, awarding appropriate honors, and creating institutional cultures that value contributions regardless of who makes them. Modern relevance. Understanding the flight nurse program's history remains relevant today because similar dynamics persist. Women now serve in combat roles throughout the military, but they still face harassment, institutional resistance, and uneven recognition. The barriers are lower, but haven't disappeared. Military culture still tends to celebrate individual heroic moments over sustained professional competence. Combat roles receive more recognition than support roles, even when support roles are equally essential to mission success. Medical personnel continue to receive less attention than combat personnel, despite their critical contributions. The flight nurse story also illustrates broader truths about institutional change. Progress doesn't happen automatically or inevitably. It requires individuals with courage to challenge established norms. It requires leaders willing to support innovation, despite bureaucratic resistance. It requires persistence in the face of discrimination and setback. The measurement of success. How should we measure the success of the Navy Flight Nurse Program? By the number of lives saved. Certainly, over 20,000 casualties evacuated represents an enormous achievement. By the technological innovations developed, the systematic air evacuation procedures pioneered then remain foundational today. By the barriers broken, Kende and her colleagues proved that women could perform effectively under combat conditions, helping pave the way for expanded female military service. But perhaps the truest measure is the lives being saved today by systems built on foundations these women established. Every service member evacuated by medevac helicopter, every wounded soldier receiving critical care during air transport, every family reunited because rapid medical evacuation saved a life. All of these represent the continuing legacy of what began on Iwo Jima in March 1945. Lessons for institutional innovation. The Flight Nurse Program offers important lessons about how institutions can successfully innovate. Recognize problems clearly. The Navy identified that casualties were dying during evacuation and acknowledged this was unacceptable. Develop systematic solutions. Rather than relying on individual heroics, they created coordinated procedures, specialized training, and integrated systems. Support innovation, despite cultural resistance. Leaders like Captain Tomlinson and Admiral Nimitz pushed the program forward despite regulations and prejudices that suggested women couldn't serve in combat zones. Measure results objectively. The survival rates and casualty statistics proved the program's effectiveness regardless of preconceptions about gender and capability. Preserve institutional knowledge. Though the Navy failed at this step, by allowing trained personnel to disperse without documentation. The lesson remains clear. Organizations must capture and maintain expertise gained through experience. And the incomplete victory. The flight nurse program succeeded operationally but failed institutionally. It saved thousands of lives. Operational success. It established practices still used today. Technological success. But it failed to achieve full recognition for the women who made it possible and failed to change discriminatory policies that forced these pioneers from service. Institutional failure. This incomplete victory characterizes many important advances in military history and in broader social progress. Change happens in pieces, unevenly, with victories in some areas accompanying continued injustice in others. The flight nurses proved women could serve effectively in combat zones, but this proof didn't immediately translate into policy changes or equal treatment. Understanding this pattern helps explain why progress often feels frustratingly slow. Demonstrating capability doesn't automatically overcome prejudice. Success in one area doesn't guarantee recognition or policy reform. Institutional change requires not just proof of effectiveness, but sustained pressure, leadership commitment, and often generational shifts in cultural attitudes. Conclusion. The broader implications of the Navy Flight Nurse Program extend from military medicine to gender equality, from institutional innovation to the nature of historical recognition. These women helped establish practices that continue saving lives 8 decades later. They proved that professional competence matters more than gender in performing essential military duties. They demonstrated that systematic approaches to problems can achieve results that individual heroics cannot. Yet they faced discrimination, received inadequate recognition, and were largely erased from official histories. Their story reminds us that progress is neither automatic nor complete, that institutions can simultaneously benefit from innovation while denying credit to innovators, and that the courage to challenge barriers matters as much as any combat achievement. Jane Kende and her fellow flight nurses deserve recognition not as symbols or curiosities, but as skilled professionals who made essential contributions to military effectiveness and established practices that continue saving lives today. Their story, properly understood, offers lessons about capability, prejudice, innovation, and the incomplete nature of institutional change that remain relevant for anyone interested in how organizations evolve and how individuals can drive progress, despite facing resistance. The sensationalized title about a forbidden morphine trick obscures this richer, more complex, and ultimately more important story. Real history is rarely as simple as clickbait suggests, but it's often more meaningful. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.